Hello, and welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. Each episode, we talk about a particular topic in the life of a professor. We are tenure-track faculty members in the sciences, working at a primarily undergraduate university in California. The purpose of our podcast is reflection, so we bring something we think is working and something we're working on to discuss.
Welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. I'm Ruth.
And I'm Claire. And today we have a special interview episode, and I'm excited to share the concepts we heard about with you all.
Today we're going to talk with Ben van Dusen and Jayson Nissen, who I met at an AAPT meeting where they led an awesome workshop on statistics for people who want to do physics education research. So here we talk about their program called Lasso. So it stands for Learning About STEM Student Outcomes, and their mission to help educators assess their classes.
So there's some lingo that comes up in the podcast that we wanted to give you a heads up on. LA is Learning Assistant, which is an undergraduate teaching assistant specifically to help make larger classes more hands-on. And then there's also the FMCE, which is the Force and Motion Conceptual Evaluation, which is a standardized physics test. And finally, the AAPT is the American Association of Physics Teachers, which is Ruth's favorite conference that we mentioned earlier. So we hope you enjoy hearing from Ben and Jayson as much as we did.
Today we're talking to Ben van Dusen and Jayson Nissen, and they're going to tell us all about the Lasso, which is the Learning About STEM Student Outcomes.
So thanks so much for being on the podcast, guys. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so to get started, would you tell us a bit about your background and how long you've been teaching? What kind of universities and student bodies have you experienced with?
Jayson, you want to take it first?
Yeah, I've taught at Oregon State University, and then I was a graduate TA at the University of Maine, and I taught a couple of courses as instructor of record. I primarily taught algebra or calculus-based introductory physics courses, and that's been over the last 10 or 11 years. And almost all of my teaching, I've had the luck of having learning assistants in my courses to help me to implement some student-centered instruction. And that's largely my teaching background. Yeah.
Perfect.
Fantastic.
And Ben, are you also a physics?
So physics is my disciplinary expertise for sure, but a little bit different route than Jayson. I was a high school physics teacher for 5 years at South Eugene High School in Oregon, and I taught a little chemistry and a little math as well. But then that was before getting my PhD, and while getting my PhD, I had the opportunity to prepare future science teachers at Colorado Boulder and get involved in the Learning Assistant program, so that when I went to Chico State in Northern California as a faculty member there, I started up an LA program. And so there I prepared the LAs and the LA pedagogy course, as well as teaching. My main teaching load was for future elementary teachers, so teaching them physical science, but mostly physics. And now that I'm in a school of education, I'm teaching science teaching methods courses to master's students who are going to be science teachers next year primarily.
Awesome.
And I've been doing that, right? So it's been university teaching for around 7 years.
And how did you get into research on physics education in particular and the equity work you guys have been doing?
Yeah, I didn't know that physics education research was a thing until I happened to be in Washington, D.C. at a National Academies event where I heard Carl Weinman talk about research in physics education research. And that was a point in my time where I started, do I want to go back into my high school teaching job, or what do I want to do next? And then I realized that's the thing. I get to do research and be an educator, and still be in physics. And so I talked to him and decided, okay, I'm going to get my PhD in physics education research at CU Boulder. So that was definitely a pivotal day that I can mark that's
wow.
when it happened.
That's my experience too, but I think I was a lot later because it was after my PhD, and I was like, I didn't know this was a thing. So yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, and for me, I don't have a clear moment. It was more, I was really interested in doing any sort of space science, and then I kind of did that for my undergrad research. Wasn't that interested in doing it after that. Physics education research seemed really interesting, and so I got accepted into a program, and I went, tried it out, and here I still am.
And that was for grad school for you, Jayson?
Yeah, for grad school, yeah. And my goal was always to look at issues of diversity, whatever work I was doing. Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's the part I didn't address. Yes, when did we get into looking at issues of equity? And mine's been an evolution over time. There's not like one point, but my dissertation work was at low income school, and looking at technology in there and getting resources for them, and it's kind of evolved. Part of working on Lasso, then we're like, okay, we have this access to this large data set. What do we want to do? And an obvious thing jumped out that's like, okay, we can start looking at these outcomes for underrepresented students because we actually have enough data to do that. And that kind of led down the rabbit hole to really digging in, and also getting to work at Chico State with diverse student populations and getting to engage them and mentor them, and that definitely helped drive my interest.
Yeah, it seems like this is sort of a side thing, but it's often really interesting to talk to men who end up in equity work, because sometimes there's just sort of if you're the female in the department, they're like, oh, well, you care about this, right? And, I do, but it's just like sort of assumed. So it's kind of interesting. I wonder, is it more like you choose the thing, or it's just sort of interesting to me to hear about how people arrive at that, because it's not kind of just assumed that you're going to be motivated to do that.
It's weird lacking the clear, oh, this is why I'm doing it. I don't have a great story. This is why I'm doing it. But I also know now, at the point where I'm at now, I'm like, I can't imagine not doing it. I'm like, I have to, that's just where my work needs to be. It's not an option to do otherwise. Not to say I can't do things, some side projects that aren't related, but the idea of not being engaged in that work just seems not optional to me. And I don't know how exactly I got to that place.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I have a pretty clear motivation and reason for why. I was enlisted in the Navy, and I was on a submarine. There are no women on submarines. There are no women. I think that might have changed.
What is this submarines you're talking about? But yeah, sorry.
So that was I was just a very toxic environment. There's actually some really good writing about how the sleep culture on submarines is very toxic. Not sleeping is a masculine activity, right?
Man.
and so when I went,
school, right?
When I went to undergrad, I saw a lot of similar, expectations and cultures in the college physics teaching. And there was, I would say, a particular person who reminded me of the worst characteristics on the submarine, and just a very hostile, sexist environment that he created around himself. And I noticed that even myself as a non-traditional student, I didn't have the skills or power to really address that explicitly, and the faculty didn't address it, and that person went on to get at least a master's degree there. I don't know. I didn't follow them, but I just saw a lot of the same culture, in the physics department and in the engineering courses, and that I saw on the submarine.
How interesting.
And I was involved in a bunch of other things in undergrad. I was in Men Stopping Rape, and I was president of a fraternity, and where we did a lot of, I would say, counter stereotypical activities for fraternities. Just trying to think about that culture of masculinity. And, I think when I left the Navy, I was also a carpenter, and the internal dialogue that I had in my head about women was not the internal dialogue that I wanted to have after being a part of those cultures, and having to engage in a conscious reflective process to, I guess, transform my internal models, my mental models. And that whole process is what really made me want to go do equity work.
That's really cool that you intentionally reframed how you think about things and made a new narrative your internal habit. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say I very consciously tried to identify when I would do things that I thought were problematic, and then just exercise them out. I was similar now, being a parent, right? With cussing, oh, I must be extra stressed because I'm cussing too much. And I was in the Navy, and I was a carpenter, two populations well known for their cussing. Stereotypes that are well deserved. So.
Yeah, I got the Irish thing, the Irish cursing down as well. But I love that framing, though, that I think so much of what makes everything fall apart now is this idea of people just being good or bad. Like either you're just like a sexist dude or you're not. So I really love this framing of like just drawing your attention to something and kind of consciously changing it instead of, you know what I mean? Like I think the framing of good or bad or sexist or not sexist is not helpful. And the idea of a growth mindset about being equitable towards women, like that's really positive.
I think for me, a lot of it is like seeing how the context and the culture that I'm embedded in is like critical to what happens, right? Like how I act, how my own mental processes are. And so, consciously choosing to be in a place that supports me being the person that I want to be, right? Like that lets me live my ideals, which is not every physics department for everyone.
No. I kind of want to have 50 podcast episodes, but I also wanted to circle back to how many people do you think like space is the siren song that brings you to physics and then you quickly are like, actually, this isn't what I want to do. I feel like space is the big lure for people to come into physics and then it's often doesn't develop. But whatever gets us in the door right at the beginning.
Space is cool.
Space is cool. True story, yes. Yeah.
It's like engineering and Apple products are part of what got me there. I was like, I want to like build cool stuff. And so physics was...
Now we're building
Jason's
a cool
laughing
culture.
At me. I was a big physics fan, or Apple fanboy. I still have all my Apple products, but not quite like I used to be.
Yeah, just to clarify for everybody, he doesn't mean like Newton with the apple falling on his head. Right?
Yeah, not Mac. Yeah.
Okay, so tell us about Lasso. Am I saying it? Is that how we're saying it? Lasso.
Yep.
And why did you develop this tool? You kind of started us off on that, but yeah.
So Lasso stands for the Learning About STEM Student Outcomes, but that was not its original acronym. Actually, we had a different acronym for Lasso, which is a good part of its history. So it was originally Learning Assistant Supported Student Outcomes, and because it began as something from the Learning Assistant Alliance, and so. For those not familiar with learning assistants, they're undergrad, usually STEM majors or STEM students who are coming back to help transform undergrad STEM course while they're still undergrad. So they took the course, now they're working with the faculty member to introduce more small group activities, less lecture, basically bring the student to instructor ratio down so they can do that, great hands-on stuff. And so that all came out of CU Boulder. Shout out to Valerie Otero, my former advisor. Was one of the co-founders of the LA program. And so I got to work with LAs, and I was actually doing a postdoc with Valerie and thinking about the LA program, and we got an NSF grant, and part of it was to look at the impact of learning assistants kind of across the country. Because individual institutions have said, well, what about my class? Or what about my class? And there's been some studies, but nobody had looked holistically, kind of across all these different programs. And so, well, what a great opportunity to collect a bunch of data. And so I actually started off just as Qualtrics, a bunch of assessments that other researchers had developed. We said, okay, we'll put this on Qualtrics. We'll ask all these, LA using Learning Assistant, using institutions, like, please come take these assessments. And we did that. And we quickly realized, one, Qualtrics is not really the platform to do this. It doesn't
Can I ask
pair
a stupid question? What is Qualtrics?
That's a good question.
Sorry,
so Qualtrics, no. Qualtrics is a company that does assessment. They have an assessment platform that you can put your own assessments up and create them. And the problem is we quickly realized this takes a lot of work to you're asking for maybe their names or student ID numbers on the front. Now you have to try and match their pre-test and their post-test. And there's all this processing that is going before I can get a report ready for the instructor who came and did this. Because I need to give them the results back. It took a lot of time and energy. We realized this is not a sustainable solution. We need to create our own system that automates this. And so that's when we brought a programmer on board. Ian Hermenihorst as being the primary one. He was a point person on this, but also shout out to Mike Oatley for his work on it as well. So Ian was a computer science education PhD, and he was still working on his PhD at the time. But so he developed this online system that you create an account through the Learning Assistant Alliance website, which is free to instructors, and you answer a couple questions about your class, which tells us a little bit about the things you care about, the types of things you do in your course. And then you select your instrument that you want to use, your assessment. There's a bunch of them on there. And you can select multiple if you want. You upload your class list and basically click the go button, and all those students get an email with a unique link that says, oh, your instructor's asking you to do this, please try your best. And they click that link, and now that link identifies who the student is. So you don't worry about them typing in John versus Jack on the post test. So it knows who's done it, and the instructor can see which students have participated. And they can click send the email reminder button wherever they want. It automates just the people who haven't completed the assessment yet. And at the end of the semester, they basically click go on the post test, and it does it all over again, scores them, matches them. So the instructor can download all that information, but it also generates a nice PDF for them with a report, so they can kind of see where their students started the semester and ended the semester, all of which is free to instructors. And then once we had this platform, we said, well, why would we limit this to just LA using institutions? We want everybody, it costs us nothing now that we've developed it. Let's get everybody to use it, hopefully to help them reflect on their teaching. Part of the original idea was please come use this before you start your LA program, so you see what are students learning before. And now that I've done this transformation, I've implemented LAs, what are they learning after? But people are changing all sorts of cool stuff in their classes. And so we'd love for them to be able to track that and have some empirical evidence to look at how it's shifting student learning or attitudes. And so now it's used by, whatever. I don't know how many institutions are in the country, but 90 different institutions or something like that have used it. And and part of the way, so that's one side of the house is what we do for instructors, which hopefully giving them evidence to look at, is my new stuff working? But then on the other end, it's also students have the option to include their data, anonymize their data, and include it in a researcher database. So it's generating this big database of student data and course level data, because instructors said what do they care about and what are they doing. And then researchers can come and access this database to look at research questions they wouldn't be able to look at otherwise, or maybe on their own. They don't have the time and money to collect this giant database, but here you can come and pay a little bit of money and all of a sudden have a big database to look at things like equity, which is the primary thing we've done with it.
Can I tell you guys my guilty confession about the forced concept inventory?
Yeah, please.
Which is a test that we often give in the first physics class we take, where before the students start, it's what are, because I guess the whole point, right, is we want to measure, is it our brilliance that is making them know all this stuff at the end, or do they come in knowing it? So we have a pre and a post. And so I've done it a few times, but then I did it, and then I had to find out where there was a Scantron machine on campus, and I had to go to the Scantron machine and do it. So I've only actually graded one of them ever, and then I just have this massive pile of Scantrons in my office that I've never addressed. So obviously I'm not... Are
you trying to set me up here? You're teeing it up for me right now.
I know, so I'm this is well, because the reason why I know Jayson and Ben is I attended a really great workshop about STEM equity, and they showed these just this beautiful process and these fancy graphs that pop out, and that has not been my experience, because also it's just matching up, like you said, pre and post tests, and then I didn't have the demographics of the students necessarily on there, and it ended up not being an informative process.
Yeah,
it's just gathering dust in my office.
Exactly the reason, that we thought, what, if we want people to do this, we need to make it as easy as possible. So when you do it paper and pencil, right, you take 30 minutes maybe of your first class of the semester and 30 minutes of your last class. You just lost an hour of instruction. You now have all these Scantrons you need to grade, so you need the key, you need to how to analyze it and maybe match data. We can automate all of that and save all that time and energy. So you don't have to do anything other than click the go button. And then generate reports. It's actually a good chance for Jayson to talk about, does collect some demographic data from students. And so there's some cool stuff it can do. Just I don't know if you want to talk about the equity report you've been working on.
Well, I was just going to go back to what Ruth was saying really quick, which is, when I first got to grad school, there were a bunch of faculty who had these piles of FMCE results, different inventories that had never been scanned. There were just a huge stack of them in the research lab. And that was one of the first things I did was you go and you have to talk to the person who runs the Scantron and kind of butter them up to make sure your Scantrons get done right. And then when you send and ask them for help, that they help you to understand what is going on with these files they're sending. And so it was nice to come into a postdoc position and work on making that process better and easier. And so Lasso collects demographics data along the way, students can choose to share that. And, those surveys are always changing and we're taking input. Or they're not always changing, but they're changing as we take input and get feedback and improve what we're doing. But one of the things I'm working on right now is we're building these applications for custom reports so that instructors can go in and they can look at how is my course doing compared to all the other courses that have ever given this inventory. And once the database is big enough, we could focus in on like, how is my course doing compared to other courses with, 300 to 500 students or 30 to 50 students or whatever, or at R1s or at HSIs, whatever institutional characteristics. But that just takes a lot of data to be able to get that fine grain. And then also, we want to build in there is the opportunity for instructors to explore equity issues within the data they're having, right? So like, are we seeing that these courses are mitigating the effects of sexism, or are they adding to the effects of sexism and racism and class oppression? But keeping that as like something that instructors can explore and kind of choose how much they want to dig into it, and with some scaffolding and structure. So that's just not like an overwhelming fire hose of information that doesn't mean anything.
Totally.
That's the two poles, is no information, dusty scantrons, or too much information. That's the two things we don't want.
I have 5 questions to unpack all that really cool stuff you said. So the first thing I wanted to know, so you're talking about these pre and post scores, and it sounds like you're talking about before the semester and after the semester, and that makes a lot of sense. But is it more than that? Would you talk about before and after a specific activity in a class or a specific content, or how is that pre and post used?
Yeah, so generally it is start of class, end of class, but we're actually, Jayson and I have submitted a grant proposal to NSF to develop modular computer adaptive assessments, which one could imagine, assessing different things throughout the semester, where you've got an adaptive assessment that is finding different skill levels and kind of honing in on them. So that's a place we want to go. Right now, it's pre-post. There's a handful of assessments that might only be post or only be pre. So, and that's an option. You can do that. And you decide when you want to give them. But generally, the recommendation is kind of first week, last week of a semester.
And can I add in, one thing I really like too is, so you have different STEM disciplines on there, and there's kind of these, what is the word? Like content related ones, but there's also more, I'm saying feelings because I can't think of another word, but there's ones around belonging, and there's different kinds of tools on there.
Classroom
right?
climate, maybe? Is that the words?
That's better than...
Yeah, like affect. I think of them as like affective instruments, affect, emotions, feelings. Yeah, so there's maybe a third of the instruments are on issues of affect, like students' attitude, self-efficacy, mindset, things like that. And those sometimes are discipline specific, like it might be like physics self-efficacy, or sometimes they might be like academic self-efficacy. So you could kind of apply them in any setting. And then about 2/3 of the instruments are like concept inventories focused on like conceptual knowledge within that discipline.
And I love the idea that you can compare across all these different types of classes and all these different universities and sort based on R1s or PUIs or whatever. That's really cool. So I think that's a really valuable thing that you're bringing with these quizzes. How long does it generally take the students to do the quizzes, or does it vary depending on I'm sure it varies depending on which one you choose, but what's a normal time frame?
I could actually answer that empirically if I thought about it ahead of time, but I think the time is probably like 20 to 40 minutes, depending on the student, right?
Those are the concept inventories, the longer times. The attitudinal ones, where it's those are 5 minutes.
Oh, really? Very, very short.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, some of them are like 10 questions, agree, disagree with these statements, right? And then you just read it.
Cool.
As opposed to try and solve a conceptual science problem, takes a lot more time. What about this answer? What about that answer?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, we've just gone through our tenure process, which we've documented at length in the podcast. But it does seem like that could be a useful tool also for talking about how great you are, or the plans you have to change things that maybe or just reporting on your class and showing self-reflection. It seems like an excellent tool for that.
It at the very least feels like a way to to stand out as different, right? Like it's a way of showing an active process of reflection on one's teaching.
As a pre-tenure faculty member, I have certainly shown up with my, results, to my department head, or be like, hey, look at like how good things went this semester, or, in talks when I'm pitching the LA program, and be like, hey, you might want to think about LAs. Look at what happened once we had LAs in here, just to have that empirical evidence, especially for convincing scientists, that like something is worthwhile. They're like, if I don't see the numbers, it might not mean anything to me. Like, okay, well, here is something. What they also say, a shortcome is right. The numbers tell a story, but they're far from the any full story.
Sure,
so, collecting the qualitative data and having good anecdotes is also really valuable. But
yeah. And I have looked at those beautiful PDFs that you have as sample PDFs of what data you might get, and they are beautiful, showing, before the semester, after the semester, the grade distribution. It's very nice.
Well, one thing that I often wring my hands about on here is, I guess it's depth versus breadth. And sometimes I feel a little stressed and maybe just concerned that like I'm going to get in trouble for not covering the same amount because I'm trying to do these practices. And this seems like a great way to say, look, but they work. Or, having something beyond me thinking everyone just seemed happier, so it seems worth it. Like that doesn't feel as solid. So, yeah.
Yeah, you see, I know a lot of people feel pressure from their peers, like, hey, if I'm teaching the intro, whatever course I'm going to be passing my students on, and say, hey, but you didn't cover these things. It's like, well, okay, let's look at these scores, though. They're doing really well, and it's kind of a shield to the criticism of, well, you just didn't cover as much,
Totally. My elusive chapter 12. I never get to chapter 12, but like, yeah.
Oh, that's great. I also wanted to ask you guys, I saw on your website you call them research-based assessments, RBAs, and I didn't quite understand what that meant. Would you clarify?
Yeah. Jayson, do you want to?
Yeah, so all of the assessments have at least some published peer-reviewed evidence of their validity.
Okay.
And what that means is that like the question that's being asked, like there's evidence that like students interpret it the way we think they should interpret it. And that the questions kind of cover a reasonable spectrum of difficulties.
Okay.
Right. So it's not like, and as we would expect, like as students get better, as they do better, the questions get easier, right? Like, like more knowledgeable students are more likely to answer every question.
It's not true of all questions people write. You might assume that's true of all questions people write, but it's not.
Right. Yeah. Like, you can imagine as you learn more about forces and stuff, sometimes wording can just get more confusing. Like there's just ways of making things really confusing. And they're not all perfect instruments, right? But there's a lot of evidence and a lot of people have investigated them, so the questions are more robust than like what I would pull out of even a textbook, right? Which is just something, someone got written $1 or paid $1 to write or something.
That makes a lot of sense. Every time I write an exam, I think, these are foolproof, everyone will understand. And then it turns out, there is a way to misinterpret that question.
Yeah.
Right, yes. I think we've all had the experience of like, I'm looking at the test and I see exactly why you would think to answer it that way. And I will go reflect on what I'm going to do about that.
Yes, definitely been there.
To give you an idea of the process that folks go through, in the validation work, kind of a good process would be you start with some open-ended questions that you give students. And so they're literally writing out answers. And you're like, okay, what are like the common answers people give? And maybe you turn those into multiple choice questions and you give it again where students do think aloud. So while you're literally like listening to them take the test, and then they just talk about what they're thinking, say, oh, okay, they are interpreting this the way I want them to interpret this.
Cool.
And then you get to do all of your quantitative analysis where you're looking like factor analysis. Like, is this getting at the things I think? Like, are these items clustering the way I think they should be? And getting at, the topics I think. And, you can go to experts and how do they also think they should cluster this way? And, you could be using classical test theory or item response theory. Look at, does each item, like Jayson said, get easier? As a student gets like a higher overall score, are they also more likely to get this individual item right? It's like, are the items working the way they're supposed to? Just kind of start with the qualitative steps, then the quantitative steps, and, then you've got a stronger validation argument in the end. So it's a lot of work that like most people will never put into making a test or an assessment, and that's
Dude,
why.
this is why my surveys are so bad. I'm like, why can't I write surveys? It's like, because I'm not doing any of those steps.
That sounds
I'm like,
awesome. That's really cool to hear how they're interpreting the question and then rephrase as needed. That's awesome.
wow.
Well, I mean, if that's what you did as an instructor, right? Like you would ask like 5 questions. Like that's all you'd get to ask, right? Like because it would take so long.
So if I make up a random survey and I'm like, please give this survey about ice cream, you guys, it needs to be like more weighty than that, right? There needs to be some, okay.
Part of the hope is the things we host, we feel good about hosting. These are kind of high quality instruments, and there's a range even of the things we host. There's ones that I think are like, oh, they did a really good job with this, and there's one's like, the line we've drawn in the sand is there's got to be some published validation, argument. Then it's kind of on the peer reviewers. We're not trying to evaluate each individual instrument. But part of the hope too is saying, hey, people have gone through all this time and effort, so it takes a lot of time and effort. We want to help them disseminate their work as well. And so actually one thing you can do, if you're out there, if you're listening to this podcast and thinking about creating an instrument, we can work with instrument developers. They can pay, and we can help them test their instrument and iterate it, and then disseminate it along the way. So that's another kind of service we want to There's another group of researchers that we might be able to help them.
And I think part of our goal along with that is that a lot of the instruments that are developed, like Keenum and Sid had an article recently in BizRev that most of the physics education research, and I think this applies broadly, is done at, wealthy, primarily white, affluent institutions in math prepared classes. So ideally, if Lasso has a much broader base of users, and it could be an easier pathway to building that validity evidence for an instrument across a much larger population of students. Because that's probably the biggest piece of validity evidence that every instrument is missing is are different populations of students actually interpreting all these questions the same? Does this instrument work the same for Black women, for first generation students, for white men, or are we just only measuring white men and just saying it's good enough, which seems to be the trend of what has largely been done.
And that's not to fault those instrument developers. It's hard, right? If you're at an R1 primarily, or PWI, and this is my class, this is the students I have to work with, it's hard. So it's, we want everyone to do better, but recognize the difficulties. That's part of it. We want to lower the barriers, if we can, to doing that sort of work.
So can I ask 2 practical questions? One is, if there is an economics professor out there listening and they have a published survey that they really want to do in their class, are you guys limited to STEM, or is it? No. Okay.
We started in STEM, and we are mostly STEM, and we have some items that are general. We have a grit assessment up there and, stuff like that. But we, looking down the road, we're was there any reason for us not to do any discipline? And no, there's not. We have our program has made it relatively easy for us to add assessments. It takes a little bit of work, but not too bad. And so we just want to find good assessments. And the other thing I should say is we only add assessments that the assessment developer, or at least one of the assessment developers has said, yes, please
of course,
host. Yeah. We won't host without their, permission. But if somebody's got something and they'd like to see it on there, we'd love to hear and get it up there and hopefully help them disseminate their work and have them, promote Lasso, and hopefully, no reason not to.
And then the other thing is, because you mentioned someone can pay. So is it for faculty who want to give the survey, is that free? But then if you want to work with you to develop a tool, that's a different story.
Pay and free are things we struggle with, but it's free for all the students and all the faculty who want to assess and think about their courses. And then to try and sustain the system, the platform, researchers pay out of their grant funding, and we put some caveats in. If people don't have grant funding, we can work with them, right? This is literally the money is just to sustain the system.
Right.
Jayson and I have never, nor will ever get a check out of Lasso. It is, it's literally keep the servers running and pay a programmer when programming needs to get done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be more if I wanted to access a really detailed data set from everyone, then that would be okay.
And so we have a data set that's free to everybody as well. It's the first 3 years of data for each instrument that it was on. Like the first 3 years it was on Lasso, make that free. So you can get in there and play around and do a study, publish with it if you want. But if you want more to really dig in, then you chip in some money to help keep Lasso running. That's our sustainability model.
That sounds very reasonable.
And the way everybody has done this so far has been like they write in those funds into their grant. So it becomes a small piece of their NSF grant budget that then gets to go to Lasso to sustain it.
Totally. That makes sense. So what do you two hope Lasso will do to the education community?
Oh, that's a long list. I mean, one thing is to help people reflect on their teaching, right? And to just make more informed decisions about what's happening in the classroom. Because like teaching is just so much work. It's just really easy to just go into rote, right? Like, I do what I did last year and everyone expects me to do what I did last year. And what I did last year is what the guy who had the course the year before gave me to do. And it's just like, and it's hard to make changes or iterate and to know when you do make changes, like, was that good or bad or who knows what's going on here. And then I think the other thing is like also as a lens for like thinking about issues of equity and like just creating a just STEM education system, which there's big limitations with what quantitative data can do there, but it's a piece of the puzzle.
Totally.
It's a piece of the puzzle that hasn't been explored much, or as much as I think it could be, because people have lacked big data to look at, these groups that, Black women make up, around, just a couple percentage points of the overall physics student population. So like if you want to say anything with any sort of confidence about that group, you need a lot of data. And so this hasn't been easy for people to get. And so there's kind of a lot of unexplored research questions that I think have value that hopefully this makes possible. Like Jayson said, the biggest thing is like if it can help faculty just think about their student learning, even if they do something entirely new that's awesome, and maybe the instrument doesn't pick up on that signal, and they're like, hey, well, I don't think this instrument's measuring what I care about. Like if they're going through that thought process, that's a win. Just anything that helped them, draw their attention to student thinking and affect and identity, then that's the best thing that happen. And hopefully, this does give them useful signal to identify specific things that are working. But just, I think that's the biggest thing that research-based assessments have done. Like the FCI, it's not that any individual score on that has been so important, but it's helped a lot of people begin to think about their teaching and the impacts it has on students, or think about it maybe in a different way or more deeply. And yeah, that would be the biggest gain. And, again, Jayson and I have a lot of thoughts around issues of inequities and how to begin addressing those or identifying them so they can be addressed.
Cool. So I was going to ask, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners? And I have one prompt is I got to do that really cool STEM equity workshop with you guys, which was very empowering about undertaking these kind of reflection practices and, we've talked on here before about doing scholarship of teaching and learning research, and especially when you have a heavy teaching load, it's a great way to do research. So is that a workshop you're going to offer again, or is that something?
Yeah, so that's a great prompt, Ruth. Over this last summer, we did a virtual workshop. We had around 37 participants across the STEM disciplines. And the goal there specifically is to support STEM faculty at Hispanic serving institutions to engage in a scholarship of teaching and learning, where they're like using robust research practices to look at what's going on in their classroom and then using that to reflect on what's going on and maybe make changes and make improvements, which might or might not have anything to do with Lasso. We're totally not limited to quantitative data. A lot of the times the best things that can help are just student interviews or small things like that. But so that is like we have a system of workshops that we hope to run. We hope to keep running that virtual summer workshop every summer for the next couple of years. We have NSF funding to do this. And then we're also running workshops at the International LA conference. That's every year in the fall. And then I just submitted some applications for workshops at the AAPT. And we've discussed other places where to run workshops that would be the most useful. And then it's focused on Hispanic serving institutions, but we've opened it up more broadly to try and build a big community so that as we target our advertising to faculty at Hispanic serving institutions, they can kind of come into a community and a network that already exists, just making it easier to get started, right? So that the first one we run can have 37 people instead of 3. A different environment and a different experience.
We did run some at conferences. It was the wrong conference, and we had 3. And I was like, okay, we need to better identify our audience.
There's some good reflection right there.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I really appreciated about your workshop was you actually, I'm using the term because I can't think of it, but it's like you set up play dates with people so they could like set up research. So now I am in a group of people researching a certain topic. So that's super exciting. So I appreciate you're setting people up for kind of continuing the work afterwards.
Yeah, and I think like along similar lines, we have some research where we're interviewing faculty about what they're doing and what they want and what they need. And like some of the interviews are with folks at 2-year colleges who teach like 11 courses a term. And it's like, people just have a huge variety of commitments. And so broadly, I feel like our work is just trying to lower those, whatever we can, just make things smoother for people to think about their teaching and engage in these processes. And ideally, a goal of those workshops is to build this network of people doing scholarship at minority serving institutions, at Hispanic serving institutions, so that they can be sharing results of like what actually works for them in their classrooms with their students as evidence-based practice. And that, everyone doesn't have to rely on R1 institutions for producing all of the information about what works with just their students, right? Then we have to take their materials and adapt it, chop it up, spend a bunch of time trying to make it work for our students in our setting.
Totally.
Yeah. One thing I'll add is, like, I missed the summer and we're busy next summer. Fear not. We have a webpage with a lot of resources and materials that we're building out. Hopefully by the time this goes live, our new website will be up, but it's stemequity.net. And our group is the NSF funded grant. We created the STEM Equity, initiative. Did we call it initiative? I don't remember.
I think we debate what we should call it.
Yeah. But so we're creating materials and having them online, and the future workshops, more of it will go through that website. Definitely point people there to learn more about what we're doing and some of these, opportunities.
Again, I love your framing of like lowering barriers and just making people's lives easier, because so much of this, like from a shaming perspective, can be like, well, why aren't you doing all these things? And like you said, like people are busy and overworked and don't know how to start and all of these things, and just all of these ways, like much like students, like trying to think about like what do people need and what would help, instead of like just be a better person, is not necessarily helpful framing. So I love that approach.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you're going to take a road trip or go camping, like, do you really want a bunch of people in the car who you guilted into doing that, right? Or do you want people who are like, they just needed you to mow their lawn and then they have the time to go, right?
Oh my God, I love this so much.
What an analogy. That's great.
Although I'm interested in this other car where everyone's just kind of held hostage and guilted. Right. What's that story about?
They're like, when I get back, I still have to mow my lawn.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, you guys. It's been a pleasure having you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much. It was great coming in and talking.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. We're delighted to have you as a listener, and we would love to hear from you. And if you want to email us, our address is contactprofessorpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear any of your suggestions for future shows, or professor quotes that you might want to share with us, or even just things that have come up for you when you were listening to previous episodes. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, we would love if you would spread the word. So the best way to spread word is by telling people if you think they should listen to it, or you can leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.